Better to live than to die. Camlin sat and waited, and his mind wandered. Camlin's dower would sit him on his knee as a bairn and warn him not to go into the dark wood. He'd carry Camlin to their window and point to the ocean of trees just south of their holding area, which stretched to the ends of the earth. Camlin thought so, at least. Then his father would tell stories about the Darkwood brigands, how cruel and vicious they were, and how they'd cut your throat for a handful of grain or a half-chewed copper. I never thought I'd be one of them. He focused on the road ahead of him, looking down from an embankment shrouded in dense foliage. A dozen black-fletched arrows were inserted into the ground in front of him. His viewing bow was loosely held across his lap. Wood pigeons cooed from above in the canopy. A woodpecker was drumming against a tree farther away. Camlin's eyes drooped, his head nodded, and he jerked himself back into a sitting position. "My father never told me how boring the life of a Darkwood brigand was," he muttered. A nearby voice said, "Shut up." "Kasalu is his chief." Words hissed from between his teeth. He couldn't see him, but he knew he was in the undergrowth, squatting and hulking like an old surly boar. "Sorry, Chief," Camlin mumbled. "Shut," I said. Camlin did upsetting Kasalu was not how he wanted to start the day. Far better to be overlooked as he usually was. 15 summers old, he'd stumbled into the Darkwood. After a moon of wandering and starvation, Kasalu's crew discovered him and took him in. He was still here 5 years later, thanks in large part to his ability to keep his head down and his mouth shut. Kasalu observed that people rarely lasted long. He returned his gaze to the road, a wide expanse of crumbling flagstone that had seen better days. They called it the Giant's Way. His father had told him that it was built by giants, and Camlin believed him. Every giant relic, including this road, was made of stone, and there were plenty of them littering the land, the majority of which were now in ruins, with only a few taken and occupied by their conquerors. Moss and lichen grew along the giant's path, while flagstones cracked and broke from years of freeze and thaw. It was still the best way through the Darkwood, connecting the realms of Narvan in the north and Ardan to the south. Good roads attracted travelers. A fallen tree lay across the road in front of Camlin, its branches splayed and roots twisting up to the sky. Birds squawked in protest as they exploded from branches to his left along the road. "They are about to arrive." Camlin reached for an arrow and casually knocked it loose. Riders appeared around a far bend in the road, 4, 6, or 10 in total. Behind them were 2 wains, pulled by shaggy-coated oxen, followed by another 10 or 12 riders. They drew closer, shifting sunlight dappling the road through the treetop canopy and revealing details about the riders. All warriors, armed with thick-shafted spears and swords at their hips. Iron torques wrapped around their necks, and their warrior braids were tied with leather. Massive, iron-rimmed shields were fastened to their saddles. Camlin saw everything in a few heartbeats, but his gaze was drawn to their cloaks, gray cloaks, that identified them as the shieldmen of Brennan, king of Ardan. This was incorrect. It was supposed to be a merchant train guarded by a few mercenaries. In Camlin's experience, paid guards fled, whereas sworn shieldmen did not. "Hold!" Kasalu hissed, muttering an unintelligible string of curses. The riders reached the fallen tree, a few sharp words from one at the head of the column, and a dozen warriors dismounted to move it, while the rest sat tall in their saddles, their gaze scanning the trees around them. 2 wains sat in the middle of the convoy, the first with a single chest and the second with 3 people, hands bound and ropes around their necks. Camlin shifted his weight carefully. His leg muscles are beginning to burn. "Maintain stillness." Kasalu hissed at him. Kasalu's chances do not look good. A swarm of ardent shieldmen wielding sharp iron and fine war gear confronted our ragtag crew. "We may outnumber them, but I don't think we can outfight them. Kasalu will allow them to move the tree and continue on their way." It was too much of a fight for him. A hissing sound came from the far side of the road, and a gray-cloaked warrior stiffened in his saddle, toppling backward in a spray of blood. Arrow pierced his throat. There was a moment when everything stopped. Camlin's heart pounded in his chest. They were expected to wait for Kasalu's signal. More arrows flew from the trees. Warriors yelled, raised shields, and drew swords as horses screamed. More swearing from Kasalu, and Camlin heard the big man's bow creaking and saw an arrow fly into a stallion's chest. Camlin struck an arrow, drew, felt the fletching tickle his cheek, held his breath, and sighted. A warrior on foot by the tree, returning to Kamlan and scanning the far bank. Release. His bowstring thrummed, and the arrow flew true, sinking a handspan into the warrior's back through boiled leather, wool padding, linen, and flesh. The man was thrown forwards by the force of the bolt after he grunted. He reached for another arrow, knocked, drew, breathed, and let go, the arrow slamming into the thigh of a rider, pinning his leg to his mount. Another arrow, this time punching into his shoulder and spinning the warrior, dark blood splattering his gray cloak. Everyone on Kasalu's crew could use a bow. They had to if they wanted to lead this life. But no one could wield it like Kamlan. His instinct for it began when he was just a baby, when his father placed carved yew in his small, pudgy hands. Another arrow, this one almost to the fletching, struck a horse's neck, causing it to rear and scream, sending its rider crashing to the ground. By this time, their chosen victims were usually broken and fleeing in all directions. These men are not like that. A half dozen of them were rushing up the far bank on foot and horseback, yelling war cries. They charged into the undergrowth, where Kasalu's boys were hiding, and fresh screams erupted as spears stabbed and swords hacked. Kamlan saw old Annan emerge from the bushes and ride down, only to see him tumble down the embankment in a tangle of boneless limbs. A few more gray cloaks had formed and were facing Kamlan. When he realized what they were doing, he felt a rush of fear. They raised their shields and thudded together as they charged up the embankment. Panic welled up in his gut, and he fired an arrow into his shield. More arrows flew from the bank, Kasalu and others. One great Lot warrior staggered, a shaft skewering his calf, but the others pressed on up the slope, 20 paces away, then 10. Kasalu, beside him, roared and rose from the undergrowth, wielding his heavy-bladed boar spear and hurling it at the approaching warriors. It slammed into a shield, pinning an arm behind it. Kasalu screamed unintelligibly and dashed at the gray cloaks, knife and cleaver in hand, chopping over the injured warrior's sagging shield. "Follow him! He is your chief!" a voice screamed in Kamlan's mind. Before he knew it, he was scrambling in the litter and soil, dropping his bow and reaching for his sword. Other figures emerged from the underbrush, more of Kasalu's crew eager to be seen supporting their leader. Kamlan dashed down the slope, tripped on a root, and collided with a gray-cloaked shieldman. They fell together, with Kasalu crouched and snarling over a bloodied corpse. Then Kamlan was rolling and grunting, attempting to free his sword from the tangle of limbs and shield. The warrior he'd collided with was growling and spitting in his face. They collided with a crunch, and dispersed like a shattered barrel, flying in different directions. Kamlan fell into a clump of mushrooms growing between crumbling flagstones and knelt down. "Get up, get up." He'd seen it before a dozen times in a knife fight. The first one to his feet was usually the only one. This wasn't a knife fight yet, but the principle was the same. The gray cloak hadn't been as lucky with his fall. He lay on the road, groggy, with a pool of blood leaking from his head. Kamlan searched for his sword, found it, and slashed the fallen man's throat. The majority of the fighting was now taking place on the embankment, with the gray cloaks battling Kasalu's crew, the clash of iron and battle cries echoing mutedly through the forest, warning him that it wasn't over yet. Men with courage. A sound on the road drew his attention. The Waynes were sitting motionless and unguarded. The first had a chest in its back, and its driver was slumped backwards with an arrow in his eye. The second question was about where the noise was coming from. There were 3 people inside, bound hand and throat, with an iron cage built into the back. The Wayne's driver was holding a woodcutter's axe and unlocking the cage door. The people inside the cage were screaming. Don't think he's looking for firewood or planning to set them free. Kamlan took a knife from his belt, gripped it by the blade as his brother Cole had taught him many years ago, and threw it as the Wayne driver opened the cage door and raised his axe. The knife caught him just below the ribs, buried in flesh up to its hilt. The Wayne driver took a step back and slumped to the ground, his face confused. Kamlan dashed to the Wayne, where he saw 3 people, a woman and a child huddled before him, and a man sitting calmly as if he were waiting for his lunch to be served. "Please," the woman replied. Kamlan looked at her, squeezing a young lad tight and looking at him with pleading eyes. A memory flashed through his mind, so bright that the world around him dimmed, of his mother and brother Cole, lying still and unseeing. blood seeping into the dirt of his hold's yard. He blinked away the thought and the sharp pain in his chest that came with it. Cries echoed throughout the forest. Kamlan looked up and saw Kasalu and a few others hacking at a lone gray cloak, with the man fleeing before them. As Kamlan watched, the gray cloak's sword snaked out, sending one of Kasalu's crew reeling back, blood spurting from his throat. The fight is almost finished, and Kamlan knew what would happen to the woman and her child when Kasalu and the others arrived, ecstatic with their victory and still covered in blood. "Run," he said to them, holding out his hand. When the woman lifted her bound hands, he reached for his knife. I remember it was still in the wain driver. He began to turn after hearing a noise from behind him. Then one arm swung around his throat. The wain driver. Apparently, a knife in the stomach was insufficient to keep the man down. Kamlan swung his elbow, threw his head back, and felt the cartilage crunch. His attacker grunted and continued to squeeze. The wain driver! The woman and bairn shied away from them, while the man in the wain simply observed them. Kamlan braced his feet against the wain's iron wheel and threw himself backwards, wriggling like a worm on a hook, leaving his attacker stunned for a few steps. However, he was swung around, and they crashed back into the wain, this time in reverse. The arm around his neck tightened. His mouth made desperate, choking and spitting sounds. A dark nimbus was closing in on his vision, with white dots exploding inside. Then his attacker grunted and made strangled sounds, his sour breath washing over Kamlan. The arm around his neck vanished suddenly, and he staggered forward a step before dropping to his knees and sucking in huge, gasping breaths. When he was able to breathe again, he stood and turned to see the wain driver's face gradually turning purple, and the prisoner in the wain with his bound hands around the man's throat, pulling the rope tighter. Kamlan charged forward, grabbed his knife's hilt, which was still protruding from his opponent's belly, ripped it free, and stabbed him repeatedly. He slumped in the prisoner's grip, arms sagging, face purple and bloated, tongue swollen. The prisoner let go of his grip and dropped the man to the ground, a sack of meat and bone. Kamlan rubbed his neck as he watched the prisoner step back and resume his position on a bench. "Come on, people!" Kamlan croaked at the woman and her baby, his throat burning. They stared at him, frozen. So he grabbed the woman's wrists and severed her binds. He grated, his throat raw and swollen. "Get out of here." She only looked at him as he soared through the child's ropes. He looked up at the embankments, heard Kasalu shout, and saw others bending over fallen gray cloaks to strip them. "Do you know how to ride?" The woman nodded. "Then ride as fast as you have ever ridden, because if they catch you and your child..." She lifted her child and dashed to a horse, a warrior's boot hanging from the stirrup. Without looking back, she was pulling the reins and kicking the stallion. In a clatter of hooves, she and her bairn vanished. Kasalu heard them and ran down the embankment, snarling commands. He saw Kamlan and strode over to him, pausing when he saw the chest in the first wain. He shattered the lock with his cleaver and then opened it. His face alternated between greed and fear as he dug his hands in and let silver coins slip through his fingers. "Too much," he grumbled. "Brennan will not walk away from this." A voice said, "It is yours now." The prisoner of the wain. Kasalu shut the lid and stalked over. He had a thick build, slabs of muscle, short-cropped hair and scars, and small, intelligent eyes. His lower jaw jutted, too large for his face, and his bottom teeth protruded like tusks. Kamlan often wondered if that was why he was dubbed the Boar. "Who are you?" Kasalu asked the inmate. "Nobody. Answer the question, or you'll be nothing with my cleaver in your head." "I'm called Braith." He let out a smile. And, despite the fact that Kasalu had just threatened a rather unpleasant death, the smile appeared genuine. Others began to join them, emerging from the undergrowth with spoils. Purses, boots, weapons, and cloaks all have coins chinking. The iron references Brennan's fallen shieldman. Kasalu's captain, Gwynne, stepped over to the wain. He was an old-timer, with iron streaks in his black hair and beard. In his left hand, he held a leather cord with the fresh-cut ears of dead shieldmen, still dripping with blood. He admired his trophies. "Out," he declared. Braith did as he was told and stood with his bound hands, as calm as if he were at the spring fair. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a hint of grace about him as he climbed from the wain. He didn't seem much older than Kamlan. "So, Braith," Kasalu said, stepping forward. They were uncommonly tall. Kasalu was usually looking down at everyone, but he was wider and had muscle on his frame as thick as an old knotted oak. "Why are you a captive of Brennan's shield men?" Braith stared at Kasalu for a long, silent moment. "That is not something you want to do." Braith shrugged as he was sent back to Narvon for trial. "What is the trial for?" "Murder." "Who?" "One of King Owen's shieldmen." "Why did you do such a foolish thing?" Kasalu inquired, placing a boot on the face of one of the deceased shieldmen on the highway. Laughter erupted around him. "Self-defense." Braith gave a huge smile. "That's what they all say," someone shouted. Kasalu looked at him again and sucked on his teeth. "There were others," Kasalu explained, his gaze drawn to Camlin. "Are you inside the cage?" "They have escaped, Chief." "How?" "When they were in a cage, their hands were bound." Kasalu looked around, noticing the cut ropes of their bonds on the ground. "They took off while I was busy," Camlin said, nodding at the deceased wain driver. His gaze shifted to Braith, but the man was picking dirt off a nail. Kasalu curled his lip at him but did not say anything else. He hefted his cleaver, then gripped Braith's wrists and sliced through his bonds. "Welcome to my crew." He walked away a few steps before pausing and looking back. "And if I find out you're lying to me, I'll catch you." Camlin was sitting with his back to a large oak. He checked his kit for the second time today. It was a routine that helped him relax when he was anxious. He'd given his yew-bow a fresh coat of wax and carried a leather pouch full of wax-rolled hemp strings. A quiver of 30 arrows was wrapped in oiled deer skin. He had killed and skinned the doe himself. He whispered as he drew his sword from the sheepskin-lined sheath he'd stolen from one of the dead shieldmen the day Braith joined them. He rested the blade in his lap. Everything appeared to change after that day. Braith had arrived at their camp nearly a year ago, and since then, the world had changed. He brought with him something unseen but powerful and pervasive: ambition. He was a natural leader, and Camlin discovered that he would do things just to be noticed by Braith, and that a word of praise or a pat on the back made him stand taller. Kasalu ruled through fear, but the power balance began to shift gradually and incrementally, and Kasalu noticed. He chose to send Braith on increasingly wild and dangerous raids, hoping that he would not return. But he did, always with a broad smile on his face. Camlin looked around. 2 scores of men were scattered throughout the dell. The sun's last rays slanted through the canopy above, bathing the dell in an amber glow. A fire pit crackled in the center, with a deer carcass turning on the spit. Kasalu was playing dice with some of his inner circle. Men here and there going about their daily business, stitching torn clothing and running a whetstone over a blade. Meat is being skinned and sorted for the following day. Stacking wood for the fire pit. Drawing water from a nearby stream. Everything is normal. Nonetheless, there was something in the air. There's some tension. Camlin went back to his usual routine. He ran a whetstone along his sword's blade. Following that, use an old rag to oil it. I sheathed it. He then repeated the process with his knife. He emptied his bag between his feet and inspected its contents. A copper box packed with dry tinder and kindling, a flint and iron, fish hooks and animal gut for wound stitching, various medicinal herbs, honey, sorrel leaves, yarrow and poppy seed, a roll of linen bandages, an arterial strap, an iron for cauterizing wounds, a needle and hemp thread, and a pot. He told himself to be prepared, or repeated what Braith had said. Braith had taught him everything, including how to be disciplined and prepare like a warrior, as a man. He is going to come back. Braith had been gone 4 nights, sent with a small crew to scout and possibly raid near the northern border of the Darkwood, where a new fortress was being built to protect the Giant's Way. Kasalu had insisted that his captain, Drem, accompany them. He should have returned by now. He packed his bag, neatly arranging everything in its proper place. An owl hooted 3 times, and his heart rate increased. They had their back. Soft footfalls on forest litter. All of them in this crew were woodsmen who could move through the forest like a whisper. Whoever was coming was unconcerned about concealing their approach. Is Drem going to enter with one of Braith's ears in his possession? The footsteps intensified. No more than 3, perhaps 4 people. 7 men have left. Men walked into the dell, Braith in the center, a warm smile on his face. He saw Camlin and nodded, then continued walking, stopping a dozen paces away from Kasalu, who was still playing dice. Kasalu had not moved, but his gaze shifted from Braith to the men accompanying him. "You looking for Drem?" Braith asked. Kasalu made no statement. Braith held up a leather thong draped in ears. The majority of them were dried-out bits of skin, nearly unrecognizable from their original form. But one was fresher, with crusted blood still on it. Drim and I had a brief conversation before he removed his ear. He told me a variety of interesting stories, the majority of which concerned your desire for my death. Camlin reached inside his pouch and removed a string wrapped in parchment and wax. He began stringing his bow slowly. "Help yourself to some bread and stew," Kasalu said, his gaze returning to his dice. "You can report to me later." Braith tossed the necklace of ears onto the throw board. "I call you out, Kasalu Ben Arder," he said, his voice echoing throughout the dell. Kasalu inhaled deeply. "Shuts him up," he said, and one of his companions, Niall, a newcomer adopted by Kasalu, awoke. The Darkwood brigands regarded him as the best sword they had ever seen. He leapt to his feet, drawing his sword at the same time, and took a few running steps toward Braith, who stood motionless, just watching him. Niall yanked his head back. He stumbled, then crashed to the ground, rolled, and remained motionless. Camlin shot an arrow through his eye. Men were on their feet everywhere, with iron scraping from sheaths and insults and challenges flying. Camlin had another arrow knocked, and his bow was half drawn. "Hold!" Braith yelled, his voice drowning out the others. "There is no reason for more of us to die. Only one, me or him." He pointed at Kasalu, who was still sitting at his throw-board. Kasalu stood slowly, uncoiling like a worm from old stories, all muscle and sinuous grace. "We'll do this Darkwood style," Kasalu stated. "Of course," Braith said, smiling. Both men stripped to the waist, and a circle formed around them. It was now dusk, with the fire pit casting huge shadows against the trees that lined the dell. Braith and Kasalu extended their left arms together, and Camlin tied a leather thong around their wrists. Kasalu reached behind his back and pulled his cleaver from its sheath. "Darkwood style is knives," Camlin said, as others around the dell mumbled their agreement. "If we're using our preferred weapon," Braith rested his hand on his sword's hilt. Kasalu glared at Camlin before casting a baleful glare at the rest of the crew. He threw his cleaver on the ground. Braith unbuckled his sword belt and handed Camlin his blade and sheath. "When I've gutted him, you're next," Kasalu growled at Camlin, patting his belt knife. "That's a wager I'd bet against," Braith said, still smiling. Camlin then stepped back and raised a horn to his lips. He blew once, long and sharp, and the fight began. Both men pulled on their bound wrists, Kasalu heavier and stronger. But Braith's feet shifted and swayed, negating Kasalu's attempts to throw him off balance. Why don't they draw their knives? They moved back and forth, casting wild shadows throughout the dell. They're gauging one another. Kasalu gave another wild tug, and Braith slipped to the side, hooked his foot behind Kasalu's ankle, and threw him off balance. At the same time, Braith's hand reached for the knife. Kasalu managed to get himself back up and lunged forward, smashing his fist into Braith's mouth and sending him reeling. Braith spit blood and teeth from his split lips. He swung his knife wildly to slow Kasalu's charge. Then they both had knives in their hands, stabbing and slashing, the iron gleaming in the twilight, trailing incandescent arcs through the air. At the same time, their tied arms were pulling, pushing, lunging, and dragging. They staggered up to the fire pit, Kasalu attempting to throw Braith into it, while Braith used Kasalu's momentum to swing them both in a half circle. They stood there, leaning into each other, silhouetted by flame and as still as carven stone, wrists locked, knives grating above their heads, lips twisted and snarling. Then Braith spat blood in Kasalu's face, and they resumed their movements, spinning, lunging, stabbing, and blocking. Braith stumbled and staggered, Kasalu's knife slicing into his stomach. Braith pulled backwards and fell, Kasalu on top of him, the two of them rolling, punching, and stabbing. They were both on their feet again, crouching low and moving away from each other. Kasalu was exhaling rapidly, blood sluicing down his left arm and dripping from his fingertips. Braith's ear bleeding, mangled from what appeared to be a bite, blood running down his neck, and another thin red line along one thigh. They looked at each other for a long time. The crackle of the fire pit and Kasalu's heavy breathing broke the silence. They then started moving again together, knives clashing, scraping, bodies slamming together. Camlin and the rest of the crew were yelling and cheering. Then Braith's knife spun through the air. Kasalu drew Braith forward, wrapped his bound hand around his waist, and twisted Braith's left arm behind his back to keep him close. Braith grabbed Kasalu's wrist with his free hand, both of them trembling under the strain, but Kasalu's knife edged closer. Kamlin felt a jolt of fear for both Braith and himself. He'd chosen his side and was aware of the consequences of that decision. The knife steadily moved toward Braith's throat. Veins bulged on Braith's face, neck, and arm. The knife was a handspan from his throat. Sweat poured from Braith's face and dripped from his nose. The knife got closer. A finger's width from Braith's throat. Kasalu gave a smile. Braith's head snapped forward, crushing into Kasalu's face. Where Kasalu's nose once was, there was a red explosion. Again, teeth flew. Kasalu staggered back, his knife hand falling and the blade slipping through his fingers. Braith followed him, pressed a knee into Kasalu's groin, pushed the big man back, and then dropped to the ground, rolled, and emerged with something in his fist. Kasalu, cleaver. Kasalu opened his mouth, blinked, and the cleaver hacked into his neck with a wet thump. Blood began to spurt. Braith released the blade and chopped again. Kasalu stumbles away, mouth flopping, and Braith follows. Another blow, and Kamlan heard bone splintering. Kasalu dropped to his knees, swayed, and fell to his face. Braith stood over him, his chest heaving, his nostrils flared, and blood spattered his face. He swung the cleaver again, severing Kasalu's bound hand at the wrist. The dell was silent. "Looks like we have a new chief," Kamlin roared, and the men yelled and cheered. Kamlin gave Braith his sheathed sword back. "I was a little worried for a moment," he admitted. Braith grinned, but he forgot to follow the first rule. "The first rule?" "Aye, the one that eliminates all others. The only rule, really." "And what is that?" Kamlin questioned him. "It is better to live than die." He nudged Kasalu's corpse with his boot before taking a deep breath and smiling through lacerated lips. "Why is everyone so happy? I have a plan for this crew." Braith's smile widened as he wiped Kasalu's blood off his cleaver.